My name is Francis Frell. I am 32 years old. And 9 days ago, my father stood at the head of a candlelit dining room table, lifted a crystal wine glass into the air, and announced to 25 people that he had finally found the daughter he always deserved. I was sitting 12 feet away from him when he said it. Nobody looked at me after. Not my cousins. Not my aunt. Not even the woman who had spent 14 years carefully removing me from photographs, 1 inch at a time. The room exploded into applause while I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, so tightly my fingernails cut crescents into my skin beneath the tablecloth. And the worst part? The worst part was not that my father forgot I existed. It was realizing that he remembered me perfectly, and still chose someone else. But this story does not begin at that dinner table. It begins years earlier. Before the speeches. Before the adoption certificate hangs over the fireplace. Before the lawyers and contracts and white envelopes that would eventually force my father to mortgage the company he spent his entire life building. This story begins on a construction site when I was 8 years old and still believed my father when he promised I would always have a place beside him. I remember that morning with painful clarity. Cold dew on the grass. The smell of wet lumber. The metallic clang of steel beams being lifted into place by cranes against a pale gray sky. My father drove me there in his pickup truck before sunrise because he said someday the company would belong to me, and if I was going to inherit something important, I needed to understand how it was built from the ground up. He lifted me onto a stack of plywood and pointed toward a thick steel beam running across the ceiling frame of a half-finished house. "You see that beam, Franny?" he asked. I nodded. "That's what holds everything up. Without it, the whole thing collapses." Then he put his rough hand on top of my head and smiled. "That's what you're going to be someday." At 8 years old, there are certain things you never imagine can change. You never imagine your father might stop seeing you. You never imagine love can slowly become conditional without anyone saying the words out loud. And you definitely never imagine you'll someday sit across from the same man who called you his foundation and watch him publicly replace you. Back then, it was just me, my father, and my grandfather Harold. My mother had died a year earlier from ovarian cancer. 34 years old. I still remember hospitals more than I remember her voice. The antiseptic smell. The soft beep of machines. My father was crying in the parking lot because he thought I was asleep in the back seat. After she died, my grandfather became the glue holding our family together. Harold Frell was not a loud man. He did not hug often. He did not waste words. But when Harold spoke, people listened because he carried himself like someone who had survived hard winters and learned how to build warmth with his bare hands. He founded Frell and Sons Construction with a borrowed truck and $12 in his pocket. By the time I was born, the company employed 47 people and built nearly half the residential neighborhoods in Ridgewood County. My father was the face of the company. Harold was the spine. Every Sunday after church, Harold took me into his study. The room smelled like cedar wood, old paper, coffee grounds, and sawdust trapped deep in the grain of furniture he built himself decades earlier. He sat me on his lap at the giant cedar desk and let me stamp invoices with the company seal. I loved the sound it made. Thunk, thunk, thunk. Like every paper mattered. Like every signature meant something permanent. One afternoon, when I was 9, Harold looked down at me while I lined up invoices into neat piles. "Francis," he said quietly, "don't ever let anybody make you feel small in your own family." I did not understand why he said it then. I thought maybe he was talking generally, the way old people sometimes offer advice that sounds too serious for ordinary afternoons. Years later, I realized he already saw cracks forming long before I did. Then Diane arrived. My father met Diane Mitchell when I was 18 years old. I had 2 weeks left before leaving for college. She worked at a dentist's office on Oak Street and had a daughter named Megan who was 8 years old at the time. At first, Diane seemed kind. Careful. Warm in the way women become when they are trying very hard to be welcomed into a grieving house. She brought casseroles. Complimented my father constantly. Touched his arm while he talked. Laughed at stories that were not funny. And my father looked alive around her in a way I had not seen since my mother died. I wanted to resent her. Instead, I mostly felt relieved. Until I realized her warmth stopped exactly where I began. It happened slowly enough that I questioned myself at first. Small things. Tiny adjustments. The kind people are dismissed individually because each one sounds harmless on its own. Francis, honey, Megan really needs more room for her crafts. Would you mind moving some of your boxes to the guest room? Francis, sweetheart, we already started dinner because we weren't sure when you'd arrive. Francis, we thought you were staying on campus for Thanksgiving. Little things. But exclusion is rarely one dramatic event. It is erosion. Steady. Intentional. Patient. My old bedroom became Megan's craft room 3 months after the wedding. My posters disappeared. Butterfly decals covered the walls. The framed family photos changed too. First, my mother's wedding photo disappeared from the mantel. Then newer photos appeared where I stood farther and farther toward the edge. By Christmas, I looked like an accidental guest in my own family portraits. By the following Christmas, they stopped including me entirely. I came home from college and found a professional portrait hanging above the fireplace. Matching blue sweaters. My father is seated in the middle. Diane is leaning against him. Megan smiled between them. No empty space where I should have been. No indication of another child existed at all. I stood there staring at it long enough that Diane finally walked in behind me and said casually, "Oh, the photographer only had one weekend available." As though that explained everything. As though forgetting to invite your husband's daughter to a family portrait was the same as forgetting milk at the grocery store. I wanted to become a structural engineer. My father knew that. He was the one who planted the dream in me when I was 8 years old on that construction site. But when I asked him for help paying for college tuition, he sat at the kitchen table, rubbing the back of his neck while Diane stood washing dishes nearby. "Engineering's expensive, Franny," he said carefully. I waited. "Diane thinks maybe teaching would fit your lifestyle better. Stable hours. Less pressure." I remember staring at him because the sentence sounded wrong coming out of his mouth. Not because of the suggestion. Because of the wording. Diane thinks. Not, we discussed. Not, I think. Diane thinks. That was when I realized something fundamental had shifted. My father no longer made decisions. He absorbed them. I paid for college myself. Scholarships. Night shifts at a copy center. Student loans. I graduated with $37,000 of debt and exactly $0 from the family business my grandfather intended me to inherit someday. My father attended graduation. He hugged me afterward and said, "I knew you'd figure it out." Then Diane reminded him they had dinner reservations. They left before the reception. The older I got, the smaller my place in their lives became. Phone calls are shortened. Invitations disappeared. Conversations became logistical instead of emotional. Eventually, even holidays felt like obligations nobody enjoyed fulfilling. Then Harold died. Heart attack. Tuesday morning. 79 years old. They found him at his cedar desk with reading glasses still on and coffee beside his elbow. I think some people leave the world gradually. Harold left like a tree falling in a forest. 1 second, everything stood. The next second, the landscape changed permanently. The church overflowed at his funeral. Contractors. Neighbors. Former employees. People Harold helped quietly over the decades. My father cried harder than I had ever seen. Diane complained afterward that too many extended relatives sat in the front pew. She meant me. Aunt Patrice physically moved me forward herself without saying a word. After the service, Harold's attorney pulled me aside. Martin Cope. Brown suit. Soft voice. Eyes that always looked slightly tired. He handed me a sealed envelope. "Your grandfather left instructions for you specifically," he said. Inside was one handwritten note. "Your father is a good man with a weak spine. This is your seat at the table. Do not surrender it to anyone." And underneath that, 40% ownership of Frell and Sons Construction was held in trust until my 30th birthday. I remember physically losing my breath. 40%. Not symbolic shares. Not sentimental inheritance. Real ownership. Real control. Real protection. And hidden deep inside the operating agreement was Clause 7.3. The clause that would eventually destroy everything. Voluntary relinquishment by any member triggers mandatory buyback at independently appraised fair market value. Failure to complete the buyback within 90 calendar days results in forfeiture of operational control under court supervision. Harold wrote it specifically for me, because he knew someday I might need protection from my own family. At 24 years old, I thought that possibility sounded impossible. By 32, it felt inevitable. For 2 years after the trust vested, I tried to reconnect with my father professionally. Emails, phone calls, certified letters, requests for quarterly meetings, requests to review company finances, requests to discuss future succession planning. Nothing. Or worse than nothing. Deflection. Delay. Silence carefully disguised as busyness. Eventually, I learned they were already planning to erase me from the company entirely. I discovered it accidentally. Diane's phone lit up on the kitchen counter while I helped set up decorations for Father's Day dinner. A family group chat. Rick. Diane. Megan. Know me. One message read, "After Sunday, we reclassify her shares as dormant. Accountant says it's easy." My father replied, "She won't even notice." Then Megan added, "Can we change the office locks to LOL?" I stood frozen beside the counter while laughter drifted in from the backyard. Something inside me finally stopped trying. Not snapped. Not shattered. Just stopped. Like a machine shutting down after running too long without maintenance. That same week, I found the adoption certificate on my father's office desk beside a handwritten speech. "I finally have the daughter I always deserved." 47 words. Megan's name was mentioned twice. Mine not at all. And still, I wanted one reason not to go through with it. 1. I signed the relinquishment papers on Friday afternoon, but gave Martin permission to hold them 48 hours before filing. If my father showed me even one genuine moment of recognition at the Father's Day dinner, I would cancel everything. That was all he had to do. Look at me. Remember me. Choose me once. Instead, he stood before 25 people and publicly replaced me. And afterward? Afterward, he thanked me for coming, as if I were a distant coworker who stopped by briefly at a retirement party. So Monday morning at 9:03 a.m., I called Martin. File it. 9 days later, my father received the white envelope. I will never forget his voice when he called me. Not anger. Not immediately. Disbelief. Like reality itself had become structurally unsound beneath him. "Francis," he whispered, "what did you do?" "I exercised my rights. That was all. Nothing illegal. Nothing dishonest. Nothing vindictive. Arithmetic. 40% of an $800,000 company equals $320,000. 90 days to pay. Or lose operational control." The emergency family meeting happened the following Saturday. 7 people were seated around the same table where he announced Megan's adoption. This time, nobody lit candles. Nobody hired photographers. Nobody celebrated. The atmosphere felt like a funeral waiting for someone to admit the body was already cold. My father looked exhausted. Diane looked furious. Megan looked frightened. Aunt Patrice looked done pretending. When Carla, my attorney, read Clause 7.3 aloud, silence settled over the room like dust after a collapse. Diane tried manipulation first. Then guilt. Then tears. Then outrage. My father cycled through denial, anger, bargaining, and desperation in under 40 minutes. But the moment everything truly broke was when I repeated his own words back to him. "I finally have the daughter I always deserved." He physically flinched. I saw it. Not metaphorically. Actually flinched. Because for the first time, he heard himself from outside the story he invented. And maybe he realized something horrifying. Replacing someone publicly does not erase the fact that they existed first. I told them about the group chat. The office locks. The plan is to reclassify my shares. Megan cried. Diane denied it. My father stared at the table like he no longer recognized the life sitting in front of him. Then Aunt Patrice spoke. And honestly, that was the most brutal part of the entire meeting. Because truth hits harder when it comes from someone who loved you enough to stay quiet too long. Harold would be ashamed of you, she told my father. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just certain. I watched my father shrink inch by inch during that conversation. Not because of the money. Because deep down, I think he finally understood something irreversible. He did not lose me when I filed the paperwork. He lost me slowly over 14 years. The paperwork was just the receipt. I walked out that day and never returned to the house on Maple Lane again. The company borrowed money against equipment to begin paying me. 3 installments. 100,000 first. Then another. Then the remainder. The business survived, but barely. Layoffs happened. Projects slowed. The equipment was sold. Megan's future role at the company quietly disappeared. Funny how quickly nepotism becomes unaffordable when contracts start enforcing consequences. And through all of it, I still missed my father. That's the part nobody tells you about estrangement. You can be right and still grieve. You can protect yourself and still mourn the version of someone you loved before they changed. I missed construction sites. Sunday coffee with Harold. The smell of cedar. My father taught me how to swing a hammer. The laugh he used to have before Diane entered our lives, and he started choosing peace over honesty. Months passed. Winter came. Then spring. I threw myself into work. Designed a pediatric hospital wing in Greensboro. Won an engineering award. Started sleeping through the night again. Little by little, life stopped feeling like survival. Then one Tuesday afternoon in April, Aunt Patrice called. Your father collapsed at work. My stomach dropped so fast I had to sit down. What happened? Stress-related cardiac episode. He's stable. They're keeping him overnight. I drove 90 minutes without remembering a single mile. Hospitals still make me feel 8 years old. It still makes me think of my mother. Still smells like endings. I found my father alone in a dim room staring at the ceiling tiles. He looked older than I remembered. Smaller too. Machines beeped softly beside him. When he saw me standing there, his eyes filled immediately. Not performative tears. Not dramatic tears. The kind people cry when they no longer have energy left to protect themselves from truth. You came, he whispered. Of course I came. Because no matter what happened between us, he was still my father. I sat beside his bed in silence for a long time. Eventually he spoke. I used to tell myself you were independent, he said quietly. That you didn't need me the way Megan needed me. I stared at him. That was easier than admitting I was failing you. The room stayed silent except for the monitors. Then he said the sentence I had waited 14 years to hear. I'm sorry, Franny. Not defensive. Not qualified. Not followed by excuses. Just sorry. And somehow that hurt more than all the cruelty before it. Because once someone finally admits the truth, you can no longer pretend they didn't know what they were doing. I kept thinking there would be time to fix it, he said. That's what people always think. He cried then. Really cried. Not polite tears. Not movie tears. Grief. Regret. Shame. I sat there watching this giant man who once carried lumber on his shoulders collapse under the weight of his own choices. And for the first time in years, I saw my father again. Not Diane's husband. Not the company owner. Not the man performing happiness at the head of dinner tables. Just my father. Flawed. Weak. Human. I loved you, he said brokenly. I still love you. I swallowed hard. You just stopped choosing me. He covered his eyes with his hand. And because life is cruel sometimes. Because love survives in places dignity doesn't. I reached over and held his other hand anyway. We did not magically repair 14 years that night. There was no cinematic reconciliation. No perfect ending. Healing does not happen in speeches. It happens in uncomfortable conversations repeated consistently over time. But that hospital room became the first honest room we had shared in years. My father began therapy after the heart episode. Actual therapy. Not church counseling. Not avoidance disguised as prayer. Real accountability. Diane hated it. Because therapy has a nasty habit of pulling hidden things into daylight. Their marriage deteriorated quickly afterward. Turns out relationships built on quiet exclusions collapse once silence stops protecting them. They separated 8 months later. Megan moved with Diane to Charlotte. I heard she eventually reconciled with her biological father. Life is strange that way. As for the company, my father eventually sold Frell and Sons Construction to a regional contractor. Not because he had to. Because he no longer wanted to spend every day inside a building haunted by his failures. Before the sale was finalized, he asked me to meet him at the old office one last time. Harold's study remained unchanged. Same cedar desk. Same brass lamp. Same bear-shaped paperweight. My father handed me a small box. Inside was the original company seal I used as a child, stamping invoices on Sundays. Thunk. 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 I should have protected your seat at the table, he said quietly. I looked around the room. At the desk. The lamp. The window where sunlight always hits the floorboards around 3 in the afternoon. Then I looked back at him. You could have, I said honestly. He nodded. I know. Sometimes closure is not forgiveness. Sometimes closure is simply hearing someone finally tell the truth. After the company was sold, my father moved into a smaller house near Birch Lane. Aunt Patrice visits him every Sunday. Sometimes I do too. Not every week. Not because I hate him. Because rebuilding trust happens more slowly than breaking it. But occasionally we sit on his porch together, drinking coffee while evening settles over the neighborhood. And sometimes he tells stories about construction sites from 30 years ago. Sometimes he asks about my engineering projects. Sometimes we sit quietly. And sometimes silence feels peaceful again instead of empty. Last Christmas, he handed me a wrapped box before dinner. Inside was a framed photo. Not professional. Not posed. Just a candid picture Aunt Patrice took at one of my engineering award ceremonies. I'm laughing. My father is standing beside me. Proud. Present. Real. On the back, he wrote. To the beam that kept standing even when I forgot what it was holding up. Love. Dad. I cried in the bathroom for 10 minutes after reading it. Because grief and love are neighbors. Because little girls never fully stop wanting their fathers to choose them. Because some wounds scar over but never disappear completely. And because despite everything, a part of me had waited 14 years for him to finally see me again. People love stories where revenge feels triumphant. Where justice arrives cleanly packaged with applause. But real life is messy. I did not destroy my father. His own choices did that long before lawyers got involved. All I did was stop volunteering to disappear. That is the part people misunderstand about boundaries. They are not punishments. They are acknowledgments. An acknowledgement that your pain matters too. An acknowledgement that love without respect eventually becomes grief, wearing familiar clothes. And, maybe most importantly, an acknowledgement that your seat at the table is not something you beg other people to validate. You build it yourself. Steady. Strong. Load-bearing. Like a steel beam inside a house that survives storms because someone finally learned its worth. My name is Frances Frell. I am 32 years old. And 2 hours after my father announced he finally had the daughter he always deserved, I chose to become the woman my grandfather always knew I was.